Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Mason Exhibitions Arlington and our wonderful panel, Intersectional Climate Justice, Calls to Action. My name is Donald Russell. I am the University Curator at George Mason, and under that I operate and manage and direct Mason Exhibitions. Mason Exhibitions has 6 galleries across all 3 of our main campuses. And this gallery just opened last November. This is our 4th program. We're gradually beginning to build audiences here. We're in a very unique position to be sort of on the street, more so than most of the other campuses. So we're really looking to use this gallery to engage local community in the issues. As far as this panel goes, it's a bit of an experiment for us as we develop new public programs. But the idea for us is to integrate art into other forms of scholarly research and discussion, and vice versa, to be very open to collaboration with other departments, and to really use art as this tool to communicate with. We have news media, and maybe they're doing okay, maybe not. It's up to you to judge. But mightn't it be interesting to see, all these major ideas in the form of art as a way of learning? So we're very excited about that. It's going to be quick, so I'm not going to say anything else. Kirsten is going to be moderating and introducing the panels. Sorry, what? Oh, yeah. I'm so focused on the program now that I've forgotten to mention the show. Yeah. We do want to do exhibitions that engage social issues, and obviously climate change is perhaps the most important issue. We worked with the Atlantica Collective and the artists themselves and welcoming them online. They will be joining in the discussion later. It's really an effort that they've been working on for several years. This is the 2nd iteration of the exhibition, and we hope in the future they will be taking this exhibition to other locations as well outside our region. So yeah, anything else, Alyssa, I should be covering? Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I need a little, hey, you. Great. All right. Kristen, thank you so much.
Hey, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to be introducing our panelists as we go through. All right. So this is me. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Carter School. I focus on Arctic coastal community resilience and specifically looking at the role of tourism and conflict and the relationship between the two. I also look at coastal management and cultural heritage and sense of place, and in general human mobility and migration. So tourism and then kind of involuntary forms of migration and environmental peace building. So our first panelist is Dr. Lisa Brelia. She is a Senior Associate Dean of Undergraduate Academic Affairs at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and is an Associate Professor of Global Affairs. She's a cultural anthropologist. Her research focuses on how people make their livelihoods from natural and cultural resources in an increasingly insecure environment. Dr. Brelia.
Thank you so much. I'm sure I'm going to have to adjust that. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. And this is a beautiful space and an incredible exhibition here today. I'm going to talk about the intersection of climate change with a couple of other phenomenon that are precisely introducing an increasingly insecure environment, play on the word environment, climate change, COVID, insecurity wrought by cartels. I've been working in the Yucatan Peninsula for about 20 years, and among indigenous Maya farmers and They make milpa, which is subsistence corn farms, for countless generations. And one thing that happened with COVID is that they found that literally in circumstances of facing starvation, the know-how of knowing how to farm could have been something that would bring them out of a very, very serious situation. But only the older people still knew how to really do subsistence farming, whereas younger people had turned to other ways of making livelihoods, specifically tourism. And another thing had been brought into stark relief is that climate change had really, really severely affected the land's ability to still be able to be cultivated. So people didn't really know how to cultivate the land anymore, but the land couldn't really be cultivated anymore. Rainfall had really ceased to be predictable, and the land really couldn't be worked any longer. And also, a third thing is that people had really lost access to land because of the trafficking of land by organized crime. So these three things intersecting together had made for a very, very insecure environment. I'm gonna go ahead really fast. So these things made a very, very insecure environment. This increasingly insecure environment is just one factor that might cause people to become climate migrants. People migrate for a variety of reasons, but climate migration is definitely something on the rise across the globe, but especially in Latin America, Central America, South America, is something that is increasingly something that we're looking at as reaching epic proportions and even crisis proportions. Millions of people are expected to become climate migrants moving forward. And so my call to action is really to pay attention to migration across the world, but in our own backyard. You might have heard about people coming to DC and Northern Virginia and Maryland, the Nova area, and being bused here. And I have a few links that you can look at to see how you can support migrants in our own neighborhood. You can, and I think you might get access to these resources, so you can actually follow the links to become a volunteer, to help support migrants here at home in many, many different ways. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that fascinating case study. So next we have Dr. Laura Sauls. Laura Eileen Sauls joined the Global Affairs program in 2022 as an assistant professor focusing on the global environment. Before joining the program, she was previously at Leverhulme Early Career Fellow. She was previously a Leverhulme, is that correct? Early Career Fellow in the Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and a teaching fellow at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Previous to pursuing her PhD, Laura has worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on multilateral environmental policy, including related to climate change, sustainable development, and Arctic environmental cooperation. Dr. Sauls.
Thank you so much, and this is really a fun opportunity. So let's get off a picture of my face. Really briefly, I want to highlight today how forests and Indigenous peoples play a role in confronting the climate crisis. And specifically, I'm subtitling this, How Indigenous and Local Communities Build Connections That Challenge Top-Down Climate Governance and Advance More Just Futures. So just a couple weeks ago, I was in northern Guatemala, just south of the area that Dr. Braglia was highlighting, in a place called Huachactún and Flores. And I was there for a workshop that we called Telling Stories with Drones. This was a group of Indigenous, community, forest, and NGO representatives from 8 countries. We had 28 people who were from 6 different Indigenous groups, as well as people trying to work in solidarity. And the questions that we asked in this particular workshop were, how can we improve forest monitoring and territorial defense using technology like drones? But we were also asking the question, what kinds of imagery, stories, and political claims do such technologies enable? And especially, how can these technologies help us tell stories differently in the context of competing claims over land, resources, and importantly, territory? This workshop is a concrete, hold on, sorry, this is a video and I want it to play. Nope. Well, if we can play, that'd be cool, but if not. This is drone footage that we took during that week, and it's a concrete illustration. Go back. That's fine. Anyway, so this should just be drone footage of, these are Maya ruins, right? The famous ruins of Tikal, which you might have seen if you've ever watched Star Wars, for example. And this use of drones is a concrete illustration of the types of technological and technical work that Indigenous peoples and forest communities take on in the context of direct threats to their land and species and culture. This is also an area where Indigenous people are stepping up, where governments lack the political will or capacity to take the action necessary to confront deforestation. There's an increasing recognition of the ways that technology also can capture popular imaginaries. So a reversal of ideas about who can drive technological advancement in the context of global crises. Who is the modern here in terms of the use of technology? And Indigenous peoples themselves are placing this appeal to monitoring and technological advancement in the context of much longer histories of exploitation, marginalization, and expropriation. This is image is a few years old. It's now been 530 years that Indigenous peoples have been defending the forests of this planet. There's an active and contemporary role of Indigenous peoples in fighting the dual biodiversity and climate crises. However, international negotiations, policymaking, and governments are not necessarily taking this role into account as they negotiate and discuss and fund efforts to stop climate change. So new green pressures that can lead to additional exclusion are intersecting with existing pressures on Indigenous people in their forests. Everything from legal mining concessions to illicit cattle ranching, combined with new exclusionary policies that prevent Indigenous people from accessing their lands, to create conditions for marginalization. But Indigenous peoples themselves are making the point that the way to protect forests ultimately is to directly recognize and support their efforts, such that the benefits that accrue from taking action actually go to those who act. So from the day-to-day monitoring and patrolling of forests, whether using drones or much more old-fashioned technologies like walking the land, to the spectacular moments that capture our imaginations, like this one at the Climate COP in Edinburgh last year, we see that Indigenous people are calling us to action as well. Communities are telling us that it's time to act, and act in a transformative way. This means right now reinvesting in alternate ways in the communities that are taking the important action, but it also means ultimately rethinking what the dominant systems that exist that cause these problems and forcing us to rethink our relations to each other and the land. My call to action is mostly to say, to recognize the role of these Indigenous peoples and to follow them, to learn more about what they're doing, and especially at times like this, it's the UN General Assembly right now, it's been Climate Week. Follow them, promote them, and let these voices be heard more and more. Thank you.
Wonderful. Up next, we have Dr. Ted Chen. Dr. Chen is an assistant professor at George Mason University, studying climate politics. His research focuses on the social and political consequences of climate change and efforts to stem these often unequal outcomes. He studies differences in how individuals adapt to climate change exposure, particularly through political participation and migration. Dr. Chen.
Okay. Hey everyone, thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be on the panel today. So I'm going to briefly talk about the impact of climate change on how disadvantaged groups not become displaced necessarily, but actually become trapped in disaster vulnerable areas. So when we think about climate-induced migration, and we heard a presentation about this already, one of the first things that come to mind is people moving away from their homes. Right? There are numerous studies that show us people respond to climate change by migrating out of disaster-prone areas or areas that are threatened economically by climate change. So this picture here shows the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, and we see that the homeowners here, at least at this point in time, wanted to relocate instead of rebuild. Generally speaking, when we think of climate-related migration, except for things like immediate displacement or evacuation from disasters, we can broadly think of them as the adaptive behavior, which in other words means things that people do to better their future welfare. However, the key here is that climate adaptation through migration access to that is unequal throughout different segments of the population. Most people experience For most people, moving costs a lot, and it becomes even more difficult when your homes are destroyed and you can't sell them, right? So when it comes to post-disaster migration, what often ends up happening is that people who want to move away cannot, and these are the disaster-trapped populations. Unsurprisingly, there's a strong link between income and ability to adapt through migration, but there's also evidence that these inequalities are exacerbated by existing social and political marginalization, which in the US context, of course, is strongly linked to racial and ethnic minority groups. What we have then is this sort of combination of two vicious cycles. So first, economically disadvantaged groups become further deprived through exposure to environmental hazards. Second, because many of these individuals also tend to come from politically and socially marginalized groups, they often become further politically withdrawn or have reduced aspirations that stem from continued this type of unfair interactions with government bureaucracy. The latter point is important because of how central government programs such as buyouts or relocation programs are for climate adaptation. And at the same time, how inadequate, as you can see from these headlines, these programs are, at least at the moment, in terms of addressing the growing need to adapt and build climate resilience. In the first article up here, we are told the story of Hampton Roads residents whose homes have been continued flooded multiple times due to hurricanes and storms. These residents, many of whom are persons of color, have repeatedly requested buyout funds from FEMA, and their applications continue to be rejected, right? So what ends up happening is they have to remain in these highly vulnerable areas. So what we end up with from this discussion is a clear link between climate change and exacerbated social inequalities, right? Which results, it yields an increasingly trapped and vulnerable population. The policy changes that are needed to fundamentally address these issues are difficult to navigate, as a lot of them are tied to broader, long-standing structural inequalities that are present in the US. So far, I've been talking about very large structural issues. But to shift gears a little bit, to squeeze as much information as I can into this presentation, my last point, or my resource for today, I want to raise awareness on something that's very concrete that we can do and doesn't necessarily require policy change. And that is, I want to talk about how insurance payouts work after natural hazards, which of course, as we've been talking about, has impacts on post-disaster options available to individuals. So insurance law is nuanced. It varies across different parts of the country, and it varies by natural hazards. But there's a tendency for insurance companies to pay less when individuals are relocating to buy a new home following disasters versus when they are trying to rebuild in the same place. And what this does is it ends up introducing perverse incentives that for people to rebuild in highly vulnerable areas when they actually would rather be able to move away. So my resource is to tell you that the courts, the legal systems throughout the US have actually historically ruled in favor of individuals, the insured, when they're trying to recover relocation costs. And at least in some parts of the country, there is a move to make this more explicitly known. And so this is an example from California, where they're trying to more explicitly write these protections into their insurance code. So when you are reviewing your home insurance, when you're buying your home insurance, or in the unfortunate event that your home becomes destroyed through disasters, just remember my final note here, right? Navigating the recovery and adaptation post-disaster is very difficult. It's challenging enough, and having more information allows us to navigate these difficulties better. With that sobering note, thank you all, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations and the panel discussion to follow.
And next up, we have Dr. Thomas, Dr. Phil Thomas. He is an adjunct faculty member focusing on global food security issues. Since August 2013, he teaches a graduate course on global food security in the Schar School and an undergraduate course on global hunger in the Honors College. Phil has also organized multiple global food security summits at Mason, as well as authoring journal articles on global food security issues. Prior to GMU, Phil was an assistant director with the U.S. Government Accountability Office for 40 years, directing multiple congressionally requested analyses of international food aid and food security issues. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in international affairs from California State University in Sacramento. Mr. Thomas.
Hello, everybody. Very glad to be here. I don't have any visuals, and but I do have a message, okay? And you know, the call to action, I think, is perhaps the most demanding issue when it comes to climate change, okay? We have to do something. And you know, I want to correct the vocabulary. It's no longer climate change, it's a climate crisis. We need to shift the mode, you know, from climate change to climate crisis, because I think it's an existential crisis. It threatens civilization and society, and we have to deal with it with that sense of urgency. So let me begin, okay? U.S. and global food security are significantly affected by the international global climate crisis. Disruptions of food systems and national and global food supply chains pose considerable challenges to public health, political stability, social cohesion, and economic prosperity. We've seen this compounded with the pandemic and the impact on supply chains and the difficulty in getting food supplies and medical supplies and a variety of other supplies. So this disruption of the food supply system is particularly significant. Agricultural production is challenged as crop yields level off throughout the globe. Ocean health deteriorates, and natural resources, including soils, water, and biodiversity, become extremely vulnerable. Okay? So we have a kind of total crisis. Approximately 1 billion people out of a global population of 8 billion people today are currently food insecure. Okay? Global society will need to produce about 70% more food by 2050, okay, to feed an estimated population of 9 billion people. A recent national intelligence estimate report notes that climate-driven food insecurity will exacerbate poverty, increase social, economic, and political instability, contributing to an increase in conflict throughout the globe. And I think we've seen this over the last several years. You know, there was some success between 2010 and 2017, and then the ceiling fell in with COVID, conflict, and today, you know, we have had a big continuous increase in global hunger, okay? A recent, this unfortunately has become an existential reality as political instability and conflict proliferate throughout the globe in recent years. It is important to note that CO2 emissions from agriculture currently account for 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions and have risen 14% since 2000. In 24 countries around the globe, agriculture has become the top source of emissions. Total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector in 2020 are as follows: agriculture, 11%, commercial and residential, 13%, industry, 24%, electric power, 25%, and transportation, 25%. Earth's temperature has risen by 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.08 degrees Celsius per decade since 1980, but the rate of warming since 1981 is more than twice that, 0.32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. 2021 was the 6th warmest year on record based on NOAA's temperature data. So we see the crisis mounting, okay? Intensifying global climate crisis affects all 4 dimensions of food security, and I'm going to go over them: food availability, food access, food utilization, and food stability. Okay, so let's start with availability. Significant changes in climate conditions have already affected the production of many staple crops and escalating severe climate variations threaten to exacerbate that. Ultimately, higher temperatures, okay, have an impact on yields, while changes in rainfall will affect both crop quality and quantity. Let's go to food access. Current climate crisis has increased the price of major crops in many regions for the most vulnerable populations. Lower agriculture output translates into lower incomes, okay? Under these conditions, the poorest people, who already use most of their income and their assets to satisfy basic nutritional needs, or resort to poor, ineffective coping strategies. Next, food utilization. Climate-related risk affects calorie intake, particularly in areas where chronic food insecurity is already a serious problem. Intensifying climate variations have and will also create a vicious cycle of disease and hunger. Nutrition is likely to be affected by the rapid acceleration of the climate crisis through related impacts of food security, dietary diversity, care practices, and health. And then finally, food stability. The extreme climate variability has produced more frequent and intense weather events, okay? and will undoubtedly continue to seriously disrupt the stability of individuals and governments, food security strategies, policies, and programs, precipitating extreme fluctuations in food availability, access, and utilization. So these 4 pillars of food security, availability, access, utilization, and stability, are all being adversely affected. These 4 pillars were identified in 1996 at the World Food Summit in Rome, okay? And that World Food Summit, okay, was committed to eliminate or to cut in half global hunger by 2015 from 800 million to 400 million. Since that summit, there have been a series of other summits committing the UN population, the global population, to zero hunger, and the most recent commitment is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which pledged to eliminate global hunger by 2030. We're now at over 1 billion people hungry globally, okay, and threatening to get worse. A certain portion of that is acute malnutrition. The majority of it is chronic malnutrition. So we have a huge problem here. So in addition to the above impacts on the 4 key dimensions of food security, major disruptions of vulnerable food supply chains have become more frequent and severe, particularly when coupled with the COVID pandemic and the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. You've seen a lot of this. Currently, the UN General Assembly is dealing with it, trying to deal with it, okay? Such food supply chain disruptions have become a major challenge for national and global emergency food assistance organizations. What are they? Such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, the UN World Food Program, UNICEF, UN FAO, and others. The rapidly escalating impact of current climate crisis challenges all national government, the private sector, the private for-profit sector, NGOs, organizations, and the international organizations, the UN agencies in the World Food Program and others, to implement a coordinated, integrated, rapid response designed to anticipate, prevent, and mitigate serious climate crisis-related impacts on food security and national security, okay? One of the speakers before me mentioned grassroots and in the terms of call to action, all right? And you know, in 2021, the United Nations held a UN World Food Systems Summit in September. And the emphasis in that summit was empowering small farmers. Do you know that 70% of agriculture production globally emanates from small farmers? And yet, in all these summits by the United Nations over the last 50 years, there's been little emphasis on small farmers. There is a need to empower people at the grassroots level. One of the questions here is, okay, you have a summit, you focus on empowering people at the local level. The question is, do we follow up on that? Do we translate the rhetoric into reality? You know, how do we do that? And so for all the speakers today, there are some simple criteria. Governance is critical to achieving sustainable global food security and overcoming climate change. If we don't have good governance that is inclusive, transparent, and accountable, we will fail. If we don't have local participation, okay, of indigenous peoples, we will not achieve this. So this is a critical call to action to empower people at all levels of society. You know, I teach an undergraduate class and a graduate class, and my undergraduate class in honors has about 25 students in it. And you know, I'm very self-conscious about describing this very negative, kind of depressing environment of climate change and food insecurity and conflict. And so I struggle every day with trying to come up with a way to create optimism, to say, you have the power to make things better. And so I leave you with that message that I think we all have an obligation. My generation, baby boomers, has failed. But I'm trying to work with this new generation to empower them to make the substantive progressive change. So that's my call to action. Thank you.
Wonderful. So next up, we have Solam Afnan Bullion. And Solam is a doctoral candidate and research fellow in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Infrastructure Engineering. He's earned his Bachelor of Science in Water Resources Engineering from Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. He is currently earning his PhD in Water Resources Engineering, completing his thesis on satellite data assimilation and storm surge modeling. Salam.
Thank you, Mason Exhibitions. Now, I'm going to show you 3 wildly unrelated images. Although they are pretty distinct to each other, they have some similarities too. The one on the left, it's actually the first ever X-ray image that was recorded by Wilhelm Röntgen. It's actually his wife's left-hand X-ray image that would go on to change physics and medicine as we know it. The one in the middle is actually the first ever black hole image that we only knew that existed theoretically before this image was actually taken by NASA's Event Horizon telescopes. Now, all these 3 images, they're one of the most, they're a few of the most impactful and recognizable images in the scientific history. And the first 2 give you a sense of optimism about our future. However, the one on the right leaves you with a very little room for optimism, I would say. This is also very recognizable, and it's the recorded sea levels in Hawaii over the past 150 years. And it is a clear indication that climate change is upon us. It's already a climate crisis, as Dr. Phil said. When we think about climate change, sea level rise is actually only one of the impending consequences that we have on us. Most of us may have to wait even a lifetime to see the actual direct impacts of sea level rise on our lives. But there are actually other consequences too that are already upon us. A few of them we have seen during this summer, the hydroclimatic extremes. If climate change was to Hollywood, this summer would be a blockbuster movie. It's an instant hit with a showdown. This summer we have seen floods in places where it was actually otherwise known as dry, mostly dry. We have seen heat waves in places where even the houses were not designed to have a ceiling fan. We actually are now seeing rivers dry up because of the prolonged droughts, the extent of which we may not have seen over the past 500 years or so. So these consequences are already upon us, and we're playing a catch-up game here. And what does that mean for water security? It means we have too little water when we actually need it, and too much water when we actually don't need it. So as we are playing a catch-up game here again, what we can do best right now is go into managing mode, go into handling these crises as efficiently as possible. So with that, as climate changes are, the hurricanes are getting more and more aggressive. That means that the hurricane-induced storm surge is also getting more and more aggravated. And to deal with that, we have built long lines of flood walls, sea barriers all over our coastline to protect our coastlines. Now, when engineers and scientists build and design those coastlines, they actually take into account two factors. One is the hydrodynamic friction factor of the building materials of the wall barriers, and the other one is the climate resiliency. And to actually consider those two factors among the materials that we have to build the flood barriers, we have a clear winner among the materials that are oyster reefs. Who doesn't love a seafood delicacy, right? But they can do just a lot more than that. So when we talk about the hydrodynamic friction factor, oysters have got the highest friction factor level, which means that it has the highest potential to actually dampen the flood, dampen the surge, and also dissipate the wave attenuation energy that are propagated by the hurricanes. About the climate resiliency, there's sort of a self-sustaining mechanism. When you put in a seed of oyster reef underwater, they cling themselves to it and adjust the height according to the water level. So it's a self-sustaining mechanism against the rising rising sea levels, which means that you don't have to call a separate tender to increase the flood wall height that can actually deal with the sea level rises. Oysters are eco-friendly. They actually filter out tons of water each hour. They protect our shorelines and create marshlands and wetlands that actually act like sponges against surges. And I can go on and talk about and bore you with the benefits that we have with oyster reefs, but my point for advocacy here for oyster reefs is that as science conveners, what we can only do is present you with the most innovative and eco-friendly solutions that are out there. But oftentimes, it's actually your opinion, your vote, your tax money, your donation money that goes on to make sure that these ideas are actually implemented. So please make your opinions heard when it matters the most. Thank you.
I'm very excited for the discussion session with all the speakers that have spoken so far. So next we have Rick Davis, who is Dean of the College of Visual and Performing Arts. Rick joined Mason in 1991 as Artistic Director of the Theater of the First Amendment, and has also served as Associate Provost of Undergraduate Education, Artistic Director of CFA, Associate Dean of CVPA, and Professor of Theater at DFA at the Yale School of Drama. Rick Davis.
Thank you. I just have one slide. How do I get it? Oh, there it is. Perfect. Like magic. And I have a timer. So in the early decades of in the early years of the 1880s, so the last part of the 19th century, one of my favorite playwrights, Anton Chekhov, wrote a charming monologue called On the Harmfulness of Tobacco. Now, Chekhov was also a medical doctor, so he knew what he was talking about. Just think about that. That was the 1880s. On the harmfulness of tobacco. The tobacco companies did a whole bunch of research in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s about the harmfulness of tobacco. We pretty much ignored it until it was so overwhelming that it could not be ignored anymore. So good science, even when presented by one of the world's best playwrights, doesn't always yield sensible behavior or good public policy. In 1879, somebody named John Wesley Powell, Civil War hero, explorer, first real inventor of the modern science of geology, a key inventor of the modern science of ethnography, a relentless crusader for justice in many fields, surveyed the American West using the Colorado River as his main initial research subject. And in 1879, 1880, 1881, he developed some policy recommendations about how we should use land beyond the 100th meridian. And if I could go back to my map slide, how do I do that? There it is, there it is. So, off mic for a second here, but the 100th meridian is kind of right about there, and you can sort of see the blue part here is where it's raining, and the brown part is where it's not raining, right? The blue part is where it's raining, the brown part is where it's not raining. The 100th meridian is the line of demarcation of 20 inches of annual rainfall per year. 20 inches is significant because that is the number of inches of rainfall per year where you can do a lot of agriculture without irrigation. Below 20 inches a year, you need irrigation. Where does that irrigation come from? The Colorado River, primarily, right? And the Ogallala Aquifer and many other groundwater sources. But the Colorado River, which, thank you for the wonderful slides in the last segment, the Colorado River is in serious trouble. Lake Powell, named after John Wesley Powell, is down to about a third of its capacity. Lake Mead, the two largest reservoirs in America, are almost at their dead zone areas where they can no longer create hydroelectric power, which will be a disaster for the West. It's already a disaster from a water point of view. The 100th Meridian Project, which I'm here to talk about, is a multidisciplinary performance piece that has been 7 years so far in the making, and we have worked with artists and scientists and historians and humanists in a series of shifting constellations of collaboration to explore why John Wesley Powell's message, and by the way, he had a platform for this message. He was the director of the USGS, the United States Geological Survey. He was the second director, but the first consequential director of that group. He had a rostrum from which he could make these recommendations. He had legislation. He had political allies. And virtually none of it was enacted. So the land use, the placement of major cities, the placement of grazing lands and industrial activities in the West, he had a vision for how to make that sustainable as early as 1882, and virtually none of those policies were enacted. So good science, excellent data, fantastic arguments. I mean, paintings by Thomas Moran to illustrate his case, right? He had amazing visuals. He had it all, and he failed utterly to influence the course of history. And so the 100th Meridian Project, among its goals, is to examine the human factors in this situation. Why don't we get it? Why didn't Anton Chekhov's monologue change our behavior in 1882, right? We don't get it as a species. We have countervailing desires and needs, and some of them are quite understandable and actually positive. Some of them are actually kind of romantic even. But some of them are greed, right? Some of them are willful ignorance. Some of them are just the basest examples of human behavior. But others are again, perfectly understand. So we as people who are interested in getting this right, finally, have to address the human factors, the stories, the narratives, the motives that make us ignore good science when it's put right in front of our faces, as has been done all day today so far, right? We've heard good science. Now we need to tell the stories that analyze and change our willingness to accept that science. And that is ultimately what the 100th Meridian Project, when it reaches its final manifestation on a stage somewhere in the next 2 years, I hope and think, will do. It's had 3 workshop productions so far at several different George Mason venues. It has elicited really interesting conversations about this question of the acceptance of policy recommendations based on science, and I think ultimately when it's fully fleshed out, it will make a major statement about why we don't accept the truth when it's placed in front of us. And that will be a significant step forward in our battle against climate change. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I believe next we have Dr. Mark Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is Associate Professor of Climate Change, Energy, and Environmental Health Equity at George Mason. He is also the Director of State Affairs for the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, and is founder and director of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship, a leadership development program for physicians of color to advance equitable climate solutions. He is also co-chairs the National Medical Association's Commission on Environmental Health and co-chairs the Governor's Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Dr. Mitchell is virtual. Wonderful. Okay. Welcome, Dr. Mitchell.
Hello, everybody. I hope that you can hear me okay. I will go ahead and share my screen. And let's see if I can pull up my presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So I'm Mark Mitchell. So today I will talk a little bit about systemic racism, environmental justice, health disparities, point out some common environmental justice issues, and then I will talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, and Justice 40, and then I will make a call to action to fully incorporate Justice 40 into the implementation of climate investments at the federal, state, and local level. Because I have a lot of material, I will leave you with a slide with a lot more information than I can convey in my 5 minutes. So first off, what is systemic racism? So systemic racism is not an insult, it's a description. It is policies that involve multiple institutional disciplines that have a disproportionate racial effect. So we all have the same laws, we all live under the same laws, but the implementation of the laws and the enforcement of the laws differs by race. So that's what we call systemic racism. So we see that with policing policies such as the stop and frisk, the justice system where the majority of people locked up are Black or Latino men. And all of these policies and more work together to disadvantage people of color. Environmental racism is systemic racism. The greatest predictor of where environmental hazards are placed is the percentage of color, not income. And this is consistent with a number of studies across states, across the US, and even globally. Greater exposure to environmental hazards leads to poorer health, and racism itself is a toxicant enhancer. That is, that if you're exposed to a certain level of toxics and you suffer from the effects of racism or even poverty, relative poverty, that the toxic effects of your exposure are much greater than people who are not exposed to racism or extreme poverty. So what is environmental justice? Environmental justice is about stopping environmental injustice and enacting environmental policies to reduce the disproportionate health effects. So what is climate justice? Climate justice is simply environmental justice applied to climate change policies. Let me give you a couple of examples. West Indian Afro-Caribbean immigrants are in better health than African Americans for one generation. Then their health drops down to that of African Americans. In Connecticut, where I live and work remotely for George Mason University, asthma is 50% higher in urban school districts when compared to rural. And nationally, asthma deaths are 6 times higher in Black males compared with white males who are teenagers or part young adults. More than half of all white boys and children in Connecticut are Latino, and there are many other diseases that are associated with the environment, including cancer, diabetes, lupus, depression. ADHD is associated, for example, with traffic-related air pollution, low birth weight, and so on. So, what are some common environmental justice issues that we see? We see landfills and dumps in communities, waste transfer stations, brownfields or contaminated land in urban areas. Under air, we'll see things like trash and sewage sludge incinerators, power plants with ammonia. Water, we will see sewage treatment plants. We will see chemical and pharmaceutical facilities that will contaminate the water. We see fish. Every state in the country has fish advisories because of the levels of mercury and PCBs. Other common environmental justice issues include local auto body shops and dry cleaners and nail salons. More than 10% of workers in nail salons have to quit because they become sensitized to the toxics in the fumes from their nail polishes and other things that they work. From industrial solutions such as refineries and chemical plants, etc. So, want to switch a little bit to talk about recent legislation that has passed, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, passed last year. It's $1.2 trillion in investment, but $550 in new investment in transportation, broadband, and energy. And they can be used to fund projects such as clean school buses, clean garbage trucks. Let me see if I can go back there. And then electric vehicle charging stations. But they can also be used to promote active transportation, such as safe walkways and crosswalks, trails, and bicycle lanes. And these are subject to the Justice 40 provisions, which I'll talk about in a second. Then I also want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, which just passed last month. It provides $369 billion in climate investments, by far the largest investments ever. And these include investments in transportation, more investments in transportation, clean energy and other energy investments, home energy efficiency. And they identify that $40 to $60 billion of the benefits are going to environmental justice communities. And then, again, it's subject to the Justice 40 provisions. So what is Justice 40? Justice 40 is a whole of government approach. It's not just the federal government, it's also state and local government to ensure that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities. What are disadvantaged communities? They're communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. All Justice 40 covered programs are required to engage in stakeholder consultation, to meet with those who are most impacted, and they're required to report data on how they're meeting the needs of disadvantaged communities. And there are 36 indicators to define disadvantaged communities. So my call to action is that you talk with your policymakers and communities to assure that Justice 40 provisions are fully implemented in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bilateral infrastructure law projects that are going to be funded over the next decade. That includes creating jobs for people locally and a number of other provisions. I have some guidance on how to do this, how to make an ask of your federal, of your Congress members and Senate. They are still in charge of setting the rules as to how this is done, as well as, again, the state and local officials will be the ones who are making the decisions on a lot of these funds. So with that, I will stop and turn it back over to the others. Thank you.
Fantastic. So next we have Erin Campbell, who is a doctoral candidate and a presidential scholar in the Department of Communication at Mason. Currently, she is a research assistant at Mason Center for Climate Change Communication, 4C, and her research primarily focuses on engaging key stakeholders in advocacy for climate action, especially in the context of climate and health. Erin, welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to speak a little bit about how we're going to talk about climate change and ways that each and every one of you in this room can do that in your own lives, day to day, and in your work. So the director of Mason 4C, Ed Myback, has drilled this next phrase into our minds that some of you may have heard, but it's basically a shortcut in how we want to think about crafting messages or talking about climate change. And it reads, simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources with compassion and kindness. And today I want to really focus in on that piece about by trusted sources, because I think that's most applicable in all of our lives. So based on survey and polling data that we've conducted at Mason in our partnership with Yale, we've found that friends and family are among the top 10 most trusted sources of climate information, and they actually consistently rank number 2 just below climate scientists. So that's to say federal agencies like the NPS, NOAA, NASA, they're less trusted than the people that you engage with in your everyday lives and in your social circles. So effective communication uses that trust that we place in each other and our friends and others as a place for common ground for communication. So you are all trusted sources with someone in your life. And you can point to other trusted sources when you start to engage in climate change. So you might want to point to something you've heard from NASA or a graphic, but you want to use your positionality as someone that has a relationship with another person to start engaging in that conversation. However, our polls, while they show that people's acceptance of the reality of climate change has grown substantially over the past 10 years in the US, we've also shown that people aren't talking about it. That has stayed almost stagnant. And this has developed into a problem. So by not just talking about it, people have a misperception of how many others also believe the same thing. A recent paper termed this as a false social reality, and in fact, people misperceive others' acceptance and support for climate change and climate policy so much, they underestimate it by sometimes 30 to 40%, and that is across party lines. So this is a major issue where communication can play a huge role. So if we aren't talking about it, we're not going to open up space for these deeper conversations, especially some of the topics that we've heard about today, like climate and health, right? We can't get to that point to address those issues if we can't even understand how many others are with us in wanting to take these steps. So the first thing I want to tell you today is just talk about it. The second thing that I want to tell you is, in order to talk about it effectively and be that trusted source, try to make personal connections with your audience or the other individual that you're talking to. You need to find a common ground. You can't just dive straight into what you think. Maybe find something that you both enjoy, like being outside, and start there, and then build the conversation. As you're building that conversation, the third thing you should do is think about the 5 key beliefs that we want to stress in the climate conversation. And so those are: it's real, it's us, experts agree, so there's a scientific consensus around this issue, it's bad, and we know it's bad, but there's also hope. Many of you have mentioned the fact today that this is oftentimes a disheartening topic, or you see students like feeling disengaged with the issue or not wanting to think about it or worrying too much about it. So it really is important to stress that last piece, that there is hope, and we do have a lot of wonderful people spending their lives work trying to address this issue. And the last thing is we've also shown in some of our work that if you're talking about it more, it also can lead to voting climate more. So in a study that I did that was predicting people saying that climate change was the most important factor and issue that they were going to the polls to vote about, the most important predictor of them saying that was actually discussing it with friends and family. That's above their beliefs about climate change and a variety of other things. So what that tells us is we need to amp up this conversation if we want action to happen. So just to recap, talk about it with your friends and family, make it personal, find some connection, talk about these 5 key beliefs as much as possible. So it's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, and there's hope. And then vote pro-climate or for climate-friendly candidates or those who are actively working to support climate-friendly policies, and help others get to the polls and get them out to vote as well. Thank you.
Okay, so next we have Emily Sample. Emily is a programs director, doctor? Okay, not yet. Not yet. Yes. Emily is a programs director at the Fund for Peace and a doctoral candidate at George Mason University's Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Her research focuses on the nexus of climate change adaptation, gender, and mass atrocity prevention. Her most recent book is Building Peace in America, and there's a link for where you can find it in the George Mason Library. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to be coming into this last today, because I think that my topic of conflict, but more specifically on gender, really intersects with everything that we have talked about today. And I think that one of the things that we tend to forget when we are talking about gender, especially in the context of something like climate change, is that it is also part of our viewpoint on climate change and our positionality in the movement as well. So all of the things that we've talked about today, I think the intersections with climate change are very or at least fairly obvious. You can talk to someone on the street and say, like, yes, obviously, like Indigenous people and climate change, like those things, I can see how they go together. Water security, health, I can understand how those things go together. But it's sometimes less clear to people on the street how gender might have an intersection with climate change. And so I just want to give a moment to explain that there are a variety of ways that gender is impacted by and can impact our future work on climate change. So to start, you have your most clear and most obvious intersections. We think of women and girl children who are walking to get water. They're walking longer and longer distances, and the longer that they are walking, the more time is taken away from their opportunities for education or income outside the home. They are responsible for sustenance farming, so we see them usually women are in charge of things like the planting time or the harvest time. And when that becomes unpredictable, that impacts whether women can feed their families. And we also see that women are often in charge of the food in the home. So if you don't have enough food, it is often the woman or the mothers who go without food to feed the rest of the family. So those are some of the most clear connections with gender. But all of those tend to take place in areas that don't connect to, for example, my life. I don't have any sustenance farming. I don't have connections to the timing of seeds. And I don't necessarily have a mother who is teaching me when and how to plant that has changed significantly since she learned how to and when to plant, which are all significant issues. But I will say here, even living in the United States, women are often in charge of food. So what we do see is women who are in charge of the food in their families, they're the ones who are making the nutrition decisions. They're the ones who are choosing if their family is going to have meatless Mondays. They're the ones who are choosing whether or not their family will be eating organic. And often they're the ones who are bearing this burden of this massive inflation right now, where our grocery bills are escalating sky high. And if they are not necessarily in charge of the family finances, this can cause huge gender-based violence issues in the home where there's not enough food or there's not the same quantity of food that the other people in the family may be expecting. So those are just a very broad overview of the ways in which food security and water security have a very direct relationship with gender. But even more than that, and this is one of the things that I talk about in my book, which is on the screen, it is the focus, and this goes directly to what Dr. Mitchell was just talking about, is the relationship with environmental justice and the relationship with climate justice. Within environmental and climate justice movements, not only is white supremacy continuing to be an issue, but also key issues of misogyny. We see most of the major conservation organizations, both domestically in the US and internationally, are run by white men. So what we see is a reproduction of these gender-based issues coming in our environmental organizations, where we have great people who are then reproducing these same systems that brought us climate change. So it is imperative for us to recognize gender as part of climate change, but also gender as part of the anti-climate change movement. So with that, thank you all so much for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussion.
So thank you all to our panelists. We will be starting the discussion momentarily.
If we're comfortable, we could just, if panelists just turn our chairs around so we can all be integrated into the whole thing. And I hand this to you for your, them as you choose, but
Okay.
for your questions that you wanted to do.
Sure.
And then be doing the questions from the chat.
So it's on.
It's on, so whenever, yeah, Crystal's gonna be moderating questions. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. As we transition to the discussion, is there anyone in the audience who had any questions to begin with? And if not, and if you, go ahead.
I'm here.
Hi, I'm curious about the oysters. How can we start cultivating more oysters?
The good news is the oyster cultivation is already like increasing. We are recognizing the potentials of that. So you may know that the Chesapeake Bay area is one of the highest producers of oysters. And this area used to have oyster reefs as working as flood barriers, but for industrialization purposes, we had to remove it because they were getting into the shipping lines and all that. But it is already in motion. We know that U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they're running projects in Chesapeake Bay area that are mostly focused on reefs and also cultivation of oysters. They're engaging the community, the farmers, all that into those projects. We know that New York City is actually focusing on the flood wall solutions to the oyster reef. So the good news is it's already on the motion, and we can always join the existing projects and even personally into that climate sustainable solution. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience before I? Oh, great. And from
From
online?
the Zoom room. We're everywhere. Okay. How do the panelists combat or prevent burnout in themselves and those they teach? What are their tips for staying motivated and coping with the feelings of hopelessness?
Would anyone like to start?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, especially as a PhD student who's just trying to make it through school and get through the next thing. But for me, finding that close-knit community that understands and being able to talk about it in that sense, and then also attending events like this one, I always find myself much more empowered to keep going and keep working when I know that there's 10 other great people doing great work in this room and also, around the world. So just finding those opportunities to see those bright spots instead of dwelling on what the future might be, think about what it could be.
Wonderful. Any more questions on Zoom room?
I have an answer to this one.
Oh, please.
On this subject, just real quick, the work that we've done with the 100th Meridian Project so far has been primarily done with undergraduate students in these various workshops, including an honors college seminar just last spring. And it has been rewarding to have these students actually confront a piece of history that they are not aware of. And it's a piece of history that I was only glancingly aware of before I started the project. And so you think about how do you actually make fundamental change and systemic change. It has to come from broadly shared knowledge, right? And so this is a way of getting 10, 12, 15 people at a time, but then with an audience of 100, right? And then hopefully an audience of 1,000. And then hopefully a film or something, that will actually tell this story to ever widening numbers of people. And in order to do that, you have to get through the dark realizations of all the mistakes we've made and are continuing to make. But then you say, now we can actually tell this story in a compelling way that is relatively non-dogmatic. Our goal, our mantra right now is we never use the words climate change in the piece because it's about knowing that something would happen and watching it happen, and you can connect the dots for yourself, right? So that the fact that that message is working in, at least in the gestational form of these workshops, does give me a lot of hope and excitement for the future.
Okay. I was just going to say that, so I do work with networks of Indigenous and forest communities, right? And for me, these are the folks who are literally on the front lines, both in terms of the consequences of climate inaction, but also in terms of the efforts that we're taking to combat climate change, right? These are the people who are in and live from and protect the forest. And they have hope. And they are continually putting their bodies on the line, physically in the context of these threats they face, but also in terms of showing up to protests, showing up to make demands on the people who have more power than we do. And so for me, how can I lose hope when I see what they are doing? And the question for me then becomes, how do I become a supporter? How do I become a leverage point myself in these systems of protest and of transformation, hopefully? So I draw a lot of inspiration and hope from the people I work with, and I hope that I'm able to pass that on to my students as well. And it's a theme we return to over and over. We can't give up, because who are we giving up on?
You know, it's really a pleasure to be here today and to discuss this issue. And, you know, one of the key points that I keep harping on is, how do we create the political will to make the substantive change? You know, I talk in class about, well, what are examples of political will? We talk about 9/11. We talk about AIDS. These are all negative examples. And how do we translate the negative into the positive? You know, how do we say, you know, we want us all to come together and to work constructively on this colossal climate crisis without being too negative? You know, and most of my students will say, and I will say, that most change is driven by negative forces. How do we create an environment where positive forces drive the change? It seems to me that's the challenge.
Could I also? Yep.
I wanted to comment, if I may. This is Dr. Mark Mitchell.
Yes.
And you know, I've been around for a long time, and during my lifetime, there have been a number of issues that we thought were unsurmountable. Things like the environmental issues, like the sulfur dioxide and the acid rain, and then there are others like the ozone layer and the hole that was opening up over the poles. And then previous to that, there have always been predictions of how the overpopulation will lead to mass starvation, because we couldn't possibly produce enough food for the populations. But it turns out that each time that there is the political will, that we have been able to address these issues. And the ozone layer, the hole in the ozone is decreasing, the acidification is decreasing. We've been able to address all of these issues. And so right now what I see is that the political will is increasing. It's not where it needs to be, but it's getting there. And I particularly am optimistic about the young people who are pushing this even more. So it's going to take a lot of investment, and we're going to have to do it before it's too late. But I believe that we can, with the people in this audience and talking to our elected officials.
Yes, sorry. So that was a great question, I think, and thank you for asking it. And this is something definitely that I've struggled with a lot as I'm doing my research. And I think it's sort of shaped my research agenda in that it's driven me to look at the smaller scale individuals, micro level adaptation, because these are the areas where I think we're not bogged down by a lot of these larger structural aspects. And not to say they're not important questions, and there's obviously very good people doing very good work in these areas, but I feel like I can contribute where I can identify these, insurance policies where if we raise awareness, it might help people adapt more, right? And so I think we could, and this is what I'm trying to do more of this type of research, while we are fixing the larger picture, we're allowing people to act and to adapt in the ways that they would like to.
Anyone else for tips for staying motivated? Okay. And do we have another
We
question?
do, from the Zoom room. This is from one of our artists, Mike Isaac, and he asks, to what extent are the scientists involved in today's talk collaborating across their many disciplines in responding to climate change? Do you believe that cross-disciplinary practices will accelerate solutions? Do you think that cross-disciplinary practices could extend outside the sciences?
I wanted to let somebody else talk first, but I can jump in and say I am 100% committed to doing interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work, because I think that these are problems that cannot be examined by only one discipline. They cannot be understood at only one scale. And I think so, thinking about the micro and the very local all the way up through the structural and global, we need to engage all forms of knowing about the problem and defining it and explaining it in order to understand and to move forward. So for me, I'm a critical geographer. I do a lot of work that is kind of examining and trying to pick apart power systems and structures. But I also work with people who are scientists who use NASA data and remote sensing in order to say, here's what's happening concretely in change in landscape. And part of what interests me and in doing this interdisciplinary work is saying, what kinds of messages can we generate using this type of information? Who can be targeted? What kinds of ideas circulate when we use this type of information and data about climate change and what's happening on the land? And even though we're coming perhaps from slightly different perspectives, we use different methodologies, our ability to engage with a broader audience and potentially make change is only stronger when we can recognize these points of convergence and try to amplify the effects of one element of the work. So that's how I think we move forward.
I just want to echo that. I think interdisciplinary analysis and coverage of issues like this, I know in food security in my area, it has been extremely powerful. There are no degrees in international food security. I think the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities finally has established a PhD in food security, but the issue is not the PhD. The issue is, how do you look at issues? Environmentally, racially, socially, economically, politically, we all have to come together on that. But I have an additional point to make. It seems to me that we live in an age of social media, for better or worse. How do we use social media via crowdsourcing and other things to increase consciousness and action, constructive action, when it comes to issues like environmental, climate change problems? How can we do that? It seems to me we know that social media is extremely powerful and in many ways negative. How do we flip it into some kind of positive construct to use it effectively in this case?
Thank you. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so it's debatable whether or not I am a scientist. I think that I'm not. And I think that most quote-unquote scientists would think that I'm not. When I first started to look at what I assumed was climate change, I was talking to Indigenous farmers, and they would tell me about their experiences farming. And they would say things like, well, it's been this number of seasons or years since I've had certain kinds of experiences with the land. And the soil has changed colors. And plants only grow this high when they used to grow that high. And whereas I used to be able to spend this long in the sun and I never got a sunburn, now I can't spend this long outside. And, whereas my seeds used to be able to, be planted this many inches below the soil, now they have to be planted this many inches. And they used to have this great detail in describing their, what I call experiential explanation for what is basically climate change. So I came, back from doing a whole summer talking to people about these things, and I told somebody like, oh, well, they're talking about climate change. And this person was a real scientist, and they said, yes, but, what is the baseline of climate change in that region? Saying like, well, what is the scientific data for describing climate change? And I'm like, oh, well, what they're telling me is the baseline for climate change in that region. They said, well, no, that doesn't count. And this to me is not fair. This wasn't fair, because for me as an ethnographer, what they were saying is, their experiences of a changing climate is climate change. And so I want for interdisciplinary understandings of climate change to be climate change and to count as climate change, and for us to have definitions that include interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and experiential perspectives. And I think that that's really, really important as we define and understand climate change.
Thank you so much. Any other panelists?
Fortunately or unfortunately enough, I call myself a scientist, and I think that interdisciplinary research is just not an option. It is the only way about how we are translating the knowledge that we have among us. So, about my research, I can show you tons of charts, tons of lines of codes, tons of maps that actually I spent time on, and I can actually tell you that in 2100 if this area is going to be flooded or not due to sea level rise. But what that translates to, how that translates to gender equality, how that translates to racial injustice, is it going to exacerbate these conditions or not? These are sort of out of my work scope. So if whatever we are doing, we are doing for the betterment of this society, and we have to translate our knowledge to something that is understandable to the society. And for that, interdisciplinary research, whatever I have, if that can be translated to provide better racial or gender equality, we have to go in the path of interdisciplinary research, and I think that's already taking place in most of the academia. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have another Zoom room question?
Yes, I wanted to actually comment
Please.
On that question also. I think that it's absolutely essential, and it's not just the research that needs to be done. Research needs to be done in every area of the sciences, and we need to change our social norms. We need to change how we live, how we act. So it requires the social sciences too. It certainly requires the political will. It requires the investment. It requires, I'm a physician, so we're changing the way we practice medicine because of it. We're seeing a lot more asthma. We're seeing much longer allergy seasons. So we as providers have to let the public know and let our policymakers know that we are seeing that, particularly as African American physicians, we see the people on the front lines. We're more likely to see low-income people and people of color in our practices. I don't practice, but I have a lot of colleagues that I talk to and I help to organize. And I hear on a daily basis what they are seeing in their practices, how it's affecting, how heat directly is affecting the number of people dying, but all of the other things, the wildfires and the smoke inhalation, we're seeing many health effects. And so, what I do is to train my colleagues to talk about what they're seeing and how it makes a difference. We also have responsibility for the hospitals and the healthcare system, which has 8.5% of greenhouse gases in the U.S. come from the healthcare system. And so we have a responsibility to change the healthcare system. If the healthcare system were a country, it would be the 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter. So we need to change practices within the healthcare system, as well as our personal behaviors and waste, as well as the waste in the operating room, and who knew that anesthesia gases are potent, many of them are potent greenhouse gases and are released directly into the atmosphere by the hospitals. That has to change. That has to stop. There are many opportunities. Everybody, I think, has a role to play. But we have to do the research while we are also implementing what we know. It's not one or the other. I think that that all disciplines have a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. So I have a question for all the panelists. For as many of you, or perhaps none of you, would like to answer. But we've heard kind of across the board about studies and expertise in Indigenous challenges, as well as challenges in communities hit by natural disasters, who then are disincentivized from moving to a more secure location. And I was wondering if any the panelists have ideas on how to, these are obviously very different types of communities, but I do think there's overlap, and how you reconcile between indigeneity of which by definition is a direct link to place, and at what point are those places no longer inhabitable, and if that is the case and communities decide that they need to move elsewhere, how do you kind of reconcile these very complex multidisciplinary challenges that communities face, which also plays into what Dr. Mitchell was speaking about earlier with environmental justice. So a bunch thrown at all of you, and if any of it sticks, feel free to comment.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Right, so we're talking about movement patterns and relocation, right? And in my presentation, I focused on people who are trapped. But at the same time, and this gives me an opportunity to talk about this, is that I'm not suggesting, and we shouldn't be suggesting, generally speaking, while there are people who are suggesting this, is forceful relocation of individuals away from their lands, right? Whether this be indigenous peoples or anyone who becomes attached to their homes. We know that these type of relocations can be very stressful. At the same time, we know that forced rebuilds can be really stressful. In terms of a reconciliation of these diverging forces, I'm not sure. But I think it's about, which is why research and policy has to be about providing the flexibility for individuals to adapt on their own terms, I think. Kind of a cop-out answer, but I do think that's the only one that we should, or what we should be striving towards.
I could definitely talk about like displacement and conflict dynamics in climate zones for the next 4 hours. It's a topic of huge controversy right now, especially in both UN and US policy. But I want to take our own advice and talk about something positive, and that is the recent, it came out yesterday, the Torres Strait 8 won their case in Australia, which, if you haven't been following it, means that this group of Indigenous people from an island off of Australia won their case in Australian court, in an Australian human rights court, that said that the Australian government is fundamentally, has to assist in the ending of climate change and pay for their climate change adaptations in this island because they are responsible for those people. And so this is a huge change in current human rights and current climate policy. So there is a potential new precedent that many Indigenous groups, especially in small island nations, will be going forward from this. And we're really hoping to see this kind of case go forward in something as broad as the International Criminal Court. So I think that's a really positive step that's just happened.
Wonderful.
You know, in my career at GAO, I spent some time in sub-Saharan Africa dealing with indigenous populations and the issue of food security. And, you know, there you have small farmers, less than an acre, sometimes less than 2 acres. And, you know, the issue is food security. They're spending 70 to 80% of what income they have on food, okay? So this is not a good situation. How do we work with small farmers in these environments that are challenged by climate crisis, okay, to develop a life that is meaningful, that is sustainable, okay? And it seems to me the problem with the US government historically has been we have a model of agriculture in the United States that is not applicable or relevant to sub-Saharan Africa, to Guatemala, to El Salvador. And we need to modify that and work with you know, climate appropriate agriculture. I'm sorry, climate appropriate agriculture. You know, the issue here is how do we deal with the depletion of water, poor soil quality, and at the same time create sustainable agriculture. We need to be more forceful, you know, in these food insecure regions, and I think historically we've had kind of an arrogant approach. Do it our way or not do it at all. And we've seen situations where farm industry materials were sent to Africa that are lying rusted, you know, because no one knew how to use them and it was not well thought out. And so we need a much more comprehensive integrated approach. This goes back to the point we made moments ago on an interdisciplinary approach. It seems to me we need to figure things out. We need to listen to the local people as opposed to impose our views on them.
I missed a little bit of the question, but from what I'm hearing, I just wanted to, point out people have always moved, right? People have always migrated, and that's part of the fact that people are prevented from migrating by restrictive immigration policies is actually a huge part of the challenge and the forces that actually keep people in places that are not sustainable, that keep people from making choices that allow them to sustain their families. When it comes to thinking about Indigenous people, and the folks I work with at least talk about the importance of their connection to the land, the relation to non-human species and geographies that are really important to what constitutes their culture and their place. But those places aren't always the ones where they originally were. Sometimes lands have been constrained by, again, restrictive policies that have said, here is a national border between what should be one territory. Or this was all your land and you weren't a stationary people. That wasn't how you made your life. That wasn't how you related to the land, but now you can only go in this reserve, right? That's the only place that you have any rights. And so we have, as a species, a history of movement on the one hand, and we have a policy system that restricts it. And so to the degree that we're worried about climate change, which is changing the possibilities for making a life in many places, it needs to go beyond our environmental policy, right? It has to go to things like our infrastructure policy, has to go to things like immigration reform. These are all bound up, essentially, in what we must be thinking about when we think about resolving the climate crisis.
Thank you. And I have, if we have any more questions, yep, in the audience.
Hi, thank you guys for being here today. It's been a very insightful Saturday afternoon. I'm really curious as to if you guys had any thoughts on animal agriculture and its contributions to the climate crisis.
Assuming Dr. Mitchell has no comments.
Okay. Do you really want me to? I don't want to dominate. I think we could talk about a lot of different elements of animal agriculture, right? We have like CAFOs and concentrated animal feeding lots in the United States. My expertise is obviously outside the United States, so although I think there's a lot of issues we could talk about in terms of domestic animal production for food. One of the biggest drivers of ongoing deforestation in Central America, which is also a huge threat to indigenous governance and rights, is cattle production. So cattle serve as a really effective way to launder money for drug traffickers in a lot of Central America. And if you don't want to buy land and you want to make some money while you accumulate land, you cut down a forest, you sell the logs that are worth something, you graze some cattle, you sell those cattle. It's a really effective way of laundering money. This also happens in the Amazon, where, of course, in the Amazon, the Brazilian government policy really incentivizes production of cattle and expansion of the agricultural frontier. So you also have expansion of soy as feed for cattle in much more concentrated industrial cattle production. So there's a whole set of relations where it's not just about, it's the production of animals for food in agriculture is embedded in systems of economic and political development that can create a huge amount of pressure on things like forests. And at least from my perspective, that's a really important, if you can see new cows on the ground, that's often a sign that there's been forest loss and also potentially the usurpation of indigenous land rights or community land rights in a lot of Central America and in the Amazon. So it's fundamentally, and a lot of that cattle ends up coming here or to Europe. And there's been some really important studies from organizations like Global Witness and Transparency International that highlight the exact role that these frontiers are playing in providing us with hamburgers. So there's a very concrete relationship between production of cattle and its consumption and deforestation and climate change. And of course, there's a lot of moral issues that go along with that as well, and philosophical issues, which I'm sure there's other people more suited to discuss. But I think that's one interesting phenomenon that probably a lot of Americans aren't as aware of is narco deforestation and narco ranching is currently a huge contributor to excess deforestation. So happy to talk more about that.
Yes, if I may, there are a lot of links between animals and climate. I didn't know about the narco cattle, but I did know that the cows as ruminants provide a lot of methane gas, and it's a significant contribution. So that's why we tell people to reduce the amount of meat, particularly beef, that they eat in order to address climate change. But that's not the only reason. We are just, we're coming out of the major part of pandemic. We talk, and I want to pick up on the deforestation and how the climate is changing the ability of animals, their habitat. And so animals are coming into more contact with humans at the same time that sprawl is pushing people to be closer to animals. And so, we believe that the COVID is from viruses that were initially in bats, and that as they've gotten closer to humans, then the virus has mutated and has been able to affect humans. And this is typical what happens. And so we expect with climate change, we will see a lot more diseases. We're already seeing a lot more diseases. We're seeing diseases in other places. West Nile comes from the Nile River, and the Nile River is nowhere near Virginia or Connecticut, but we are seeing West Nile disease, diseases that were tropical, Eastern encephalitis, other diseases, monkeypox. It's because, again, partially because of climate, but climate pushing animals and humans into closer contact, that we're seeing a lot of diseases spread to places where they've never been before, and we're also seeing new diseases that are related to climate change.
I think that raises the issue of, in an increasingly globalized world, okay, how do we deal from a regulatory point of view with these type of problems? Do we have the World Health Organization, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization come together and collaborate? And, we saw with the pandemic, there are limitations on an international organization like WHO. Should we be moving more towards a regulatory process, not just an advisory process for international organizations, so that we can deal with these issues that cross borders and affect health and climate?
Just to provide some balance in our conversation, there are some really positive things happening in climate adaptation and mitigation around livestock. And for example, going back to what you were talking about with listening to locals about what their baseline is, knowing what kind of animals work best in a changing climate. So there are different species of cows, there are different species of goats, different species of chickens who are more productive on different levels of water, different temperature levels, different types of feed. So understanding and being able to have some of those, especially south to south conversations, global south to global south conversations about, okay, this is, we used to have this type of cow. It is, I can only afford to keep one now when I used to be able to afford to keep 3. If you are able to change the species that you raise to a species that maybe requires less water, and again, I'm talking on very small scale, not large scale industrial agricultural farming, livestock farming, but there are ways to boost household income with these mitigation and adaptation effects of cross-learning different types of livestock. And so there has been some really positive small-scale efforts coming out of that kind of learning process.
Wonderful. So I think, okay. Oh.
So do you want to go ahead? Or? Okay. Thank you so much for, it's a great panelist. So I have a question and it's open-ended to anyone. So the thing is, what do you suggest for efficient way of food security in terms of climate crisis? Because the global population density is not uniform across the different parts of the world, and also the extreme characteristics is different as well. And there are not only the extremes, there are compounding hazards happening. So it can be prolonged drought, and then it can be extensive level of floods happening around the globe. So how should you prepare for all these scenarios, considering probably for planning for 2050s, for example, if we go ahead with all of this? Thank you. You're the food security person.
Well, I think the good news is that the UN IPCC reports are getting more specific on issues like agriculture and food security, and from a global perspective. The problem with the IPCC reports is there global political will? How do you engender global political will? Do we keep providing advisory comments, backed by science, that this is what we need to do, and then essentially ignore it? I mean, I attended the World Food Summit in 1996 for the U.S., and there was a clear commitment, to a cut in half global hunger, and that each country would have a national plan of action to do that. Went back in 4 years later, wrote a GAO report. No political will among member countries, nor the international organizations to implement it. And this is kind of a continuum that takes place. And so there really is a need to demonstrate results. And the nature of the international system, unfortunately, is still very advisory. There needs to be UN reform. And how to get that reform is the real challenge. I mean, we already see the problems with the Security Council, but just generally in areas like agriculture and food security, how do we bring everybody together? We have the FAO in Rome with 190 some countries, okay? And that seems to work to a limited extent, but it hasn't worked to the point that the Secretary General established a high-level panel on food security because he was so frustrated with the UN World Food Program, FAO, and IFAD not communicating. They all reside, their headquarters all reside in Rome, but for some reason they're not coming out with an integrated approach. Now, we do see the annual food security reports by the UN agencies having all 3 imprimaturs of the agencies. So, there's some slow reform. But, the point here is there is a need for a call to action. And for some reason, we're not translating that well to individual countries and to the global community. And anybody who has ideas on how to create the necessary political will, please come forward.
Thank you all. This has been really terrific. I did want to ask one last question on behalf of the artists, in effect. In looking at this exhibition, was there anything in particular that sort of struck you or changed your mind about something, or you thought was not correct or something like that. If anybody's had a chance to look and wants to put a few words in for the artists, that would be great.
Okay, that's a softball, but it's a great one, especially as the last question. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate all of the artists because each piece really speaks, I think, in a clear voice, and I really think this is an amazing exhibition. I'm most taken with the piece I'm looking at right now behind you. I think it's Katie Kehoe's piece, Superimpositions, if I remember the title correctly, and I invite people to spend time with this piece, not to just look at it as a static piece, because it's real landscapes with imaginary wildfires, and that is an act of imagination that really puts you in the world of what would happen to my backyard, what would happen to my hometown, what would happen to my world if climate change continues to drive wildfires and the urban wildland interface that we heard about continues to get tighter. This is what's happening. And so this is the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier about telling a story that awakens your imagination as a non-scientist, as a citizen, to say, oh my goodness, this is actually happening, and we've got to get in front of it before what we're looking at right now on that screen comes to all of us.
Anybody else?
So I come from the world of genocide studies. My background is in genocide studies and prevention. And we have the same question all the time is, how do we humanize the moment and how do we connect with that? And I think art has been a really significant part of that. And what I see here in this gallery and also just in climate change art as I've been viewing it is the humanization and the connection building that is so essential for people to bring the effects of climate change into their own sphere. There is a famous op-ed by Nicholas Kristof called "Save the Darfur Puppy," and it is about how people when asked to donate to Darfur, which was at the time in the middle of experiencing a horrific genocide, people were like, not really. But if you show them a picture of a single puppy and ask them to donate for the health and well-being of that single puppy, people are willing to throw in a few dollars. And so I think what art does, and I think that the piece you're talking about, I've been watching it as we're sitting here, does that, and it gives you that sense of that one puppy or that one sea turtle. We all cut our rings now, right, because of the sad pictures of seagulls, and that art is able to bring that humanization and that puppy imagery to us to actually stimulate that political will that we're looking for.
Sure. All right. So to follow up on that point and to echo back to what we were talking about earlier with interdisciplinary work, I think actually this is an area that there could be a lot of collaboration. Not necessarily to put numbers to everything, but we can study the impact of art as climate communication medium. And climate communication is hard, and while there have been inroads, it's still very difficult. We know most things don't work well. And maybe someone can speak about this later, but maybe we can turn more to using art as climate communication tools, and yeah.
I was going to point to the specific piece behind Ted with the plastic bags as one that really caught my eye for two reasons. And the first reason is that one of the things I've increasingly noticed doing work in parts of coastal and forested Central America is the massive uptick in the use of single-use disposable plastics in these areas where there's no production facilities, right? There's no extraction for the oil to make the plastic bags. And there's no solid waste management capacity either. And yet, these plastic bags have become ubiquitous. But in interesting ways, they're often used multiple times for multiple things, right? They have an afterlife that might not be as pollution, but also might be. And so this really struck me because it's something that's really, I've noticed a lot and I've worried about, but also thinking that these plastic bags play multiple roles in how people creatively use something that is still a very recent introduction to their daily lives. It also made me think about recent news on the environmental health implications of cracking, which is fracking for the production of plastics, and the ongoing government subsidies that support this practice in places that are very close to here, right? West Virginia, Pennsylvania, our neighboring states that are essentially seeing massive environmental health disruptions, specifically to create single-use and very, very disposable, but not in a good way, plastics. So it was making me think of just the scale and degree to which these disposability plays a role in our life and the way that our systems are set up. So it's about individual choice, and we need to think about it at that scale, but also ultimately about the kinds of subsidies that our government puts into place and what role we have to say enough is enough. Enough fossil fuels is enough.
So,
Sorry.
please go ahead.
I was just going to add one final comment from the communication perspective. Dr. Chen was correct. There is no good one silver bullet way to do climate communication. Most of the experiments I run don't show large effects. They show small effects for small groups of people. And when you're communicating, what resonates with one individual might not with another. It might resonate with one group and not another. So target audience is important. But also what resonates with one individual one day might not resonate with them again the next. And so communication is entirely dynamic in its own right. And I feel like the art displayed here really points back to one of my original messages, that we do need these simple, clear messages that are repeated often by a variety of sources. And the source can be art, it can be a message on a TV, it can be a film, and you can interpret that in any way, but making it very poignant like each of the artists in this exhibition have done, which I think they've done extremely well, is one way to just tackle this communication perspective and tackle this issue from a lot of different angles.
I'll be really quick. So I'll also point out to these pictures here, and what sort of struck me is that how the phrase "thank you" is focused in here. It's sort of kind of dark, grim way of pointing some of the hypocrisies that we observe in our everyday life and sort of make those choices, and that focuses on a self-critical way. That thing really struck me. Thanks for putting that up on there. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. I think it's clear this was a great success, and it's been just wonderful to have so many different voices in the room and to have sort of art be the gathering place for that. So thank you so much for that. One little announcement is that our program for this exhibition ends next Saturday with a performance art piece by Katie Kehoe, the artist here who did this, the video behind us. And it will take part both here and in Fairfax. You should definitely get involved. It's a tree planting performance art piece. So the first part will be introductory here, and then everybody needs to move out to campus where we will plant 100 trees in places that the university needs trees, there's quite a few. So yeah, I hope you all will put that in your calendars and show up. I think it'll be quite a great event. Is there anything else I need to cover? Thank you. Terrific job, everybody. Let's do more More. All right. Thank you.